Leo XIII considers the question of the obligations of temporal society to the true religion of the one Church of Christ most explicitly in Immortale Dei, which is an encyclical which the Second Vatican Council's decree on religious liberty directly cites on this point. The most important precondition of a correct understanding for this doctrine is to see that the state is a juridical person in natural law. What does that mean? What that means is because the state wills and knows certain things, the state knows that somebody is guilty of X, Y, or Z when they are convicted of that crime. The state knows that certain pieces of evidence exist when it admits them into consideration in a court, etc. So the state acts like a person, like a natural person, in certain circumstances, in certain ways, within certain limitations. And it's constituted as willing and knowing certain things, as acting like a person by human nature and therefore by God. Therefore, in natural law, just as the McDonald's Corporation or Microsoft or whatever function as persons for certain purposes in law, but they're artificial persons created by the shareholders of that corporation, so the state is a natural juridical person constituted by natural law, which has the same obligations to the Ten Commandments as an individual person does. This means that the state has to worship God in the manner he has appointed, just like the individual does. That's why the state must find the way of worship that God has appointed and embrace it, and therefore become, in some sense, part of the church. Now, ancient peoples, prior to the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, would not have thought that there must therefore be a parallel society which deals with religious questions alongside the city or the tribe. They would have thought that the most important obligation and duty of the city and the tribe is to worship God in the manner he has appointed. Therefore, the most senior officer within the natural state would be the highest priest of the religion of the people within that state. That was the assumption of people in ancient times. That's why the Roman emperor was Pontifex Maximus, according to Roman law. Julius Caesar and Augustus, and then all of Augustus' successors held that title of Pontifex Maximus, which is now held by the Pope. The reason for that is because quite naturally one would think that there's no need for another society. Why would you take the most important obligation of human society and give it to another society? That doesn't make any sense. Of course, it does make sense. The reason why is because man has two ends: the supernatural end, the vision of God, and the natural end, the perfection of his nature according to his own resources, which would be being a sort of philosopher-statesman with a large and loving family, I suppose, would be the somebody like Thomas More or Boethius would be the exemplary natural human being. But these now, this would still, even though there's a distinction there between the natural and the supernatural, there would be no necessity for two different societies. The reason why the two different societies arise is because of the fall, because man is conceived already with a disordered attachment to an infinite good which he cannot satisfy by means of finite resources. That means that man is born with the four wounds of the soul: ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence, the opposites of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, the four cardinal virtues. And therefore there is a tension between the natural man and the supernatural man, whereas by nature they should be in harmony. As a result of sin, there is tension. And that means that if the same person is entrusted with authority over the attainment of natural happiness and natural affairs, as is entrusted with authority over the attainment of supernatural happiness and supernatural affairs, what will inevitably occur is simony. That is, people will try to sell spiritual goods in order to obtain natural goods, or they will try to purchase spiritual goods by means of natural goods. Either of those two is simony, the exchange of natural and supernatural goods. That is blasphemous, because the supernatural end of man is infinitely valuable. So to offer anything created in exchange for it is to insult God in the most heinous manner possible. That's why we should never exchange one for the other, and cannot exchange one for the other. This is why God distinguishes the priest and the king. Now, of course, famously, he does not distinguish the priest and the king in the case of our Lord Jesus Christ, because he is completely without sin, perfect, divine person of infinite dignity with a spotless human nature, and therefore he is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, who is both priest and king simultaneously. But in regard to human beings who are in a fallen state, these distinctions have to be maintained. Moses and Aaron have two different jobs. When our Lord ordains the apostles to the episcopate at the Last Supper, he tells them to obtain swords, and they say, "Lord, here are 2 swords," and he says, "It is enough." And Pope Boniface XIII, in his infallible bull Unam Sanctam, explains to us that those 2 swords symbolize the spiritual and the temporal power. And although ultimate supervisory authority over the temporal power must belong to the spiritual power, because it's the teaching office of the church which judges ultimately whether or not a temporal ruler has transgressed the natural or the divine law, and therefore he ultimately presides over both the temporal and the spiritual, the bishop and ultimately the Bishop of Rome. Nevertheless, he should not, except in a case of necessity, ever wield the temporal power, because he is a fallen man like other men, and therefore he is open to the temptation to misuse it. So, as Boniface VIII points out, our Lord says to St. Peter when he cuts off the high priest's servant's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane with one of those 2 swords, he says, "Put up thy sword into thy scabbard," meaning put back your sword into your scabbard. So he admits that it's Peter's sword, but he tells him not to use it. So someone who is not a bishop has to use the temporal sword, and that is the lay ruler. That is one of the foundational reasons why, as the Second Vatican Council says, the ordering of temporal affairs to man's true destiny is so much the job of the laity that it cannot be taken on by any other. So we have 2 powers. The lower power, the temporal power, must acknowledge and embrace the true religion, but it's not allowed to exercise authority over the true religion, lest it fall into the sin of simony. A separate authority is instituted, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the bishops in communion with the Pope, and that authority has authority over the true religion, but lest the fallen human beings who are ordained to the episcopate fall victim to the temptation to misuse it for temporal reasons, they are forbidden except in case of necessity, as exists with the Pope having temporal dominion over the area where he lives to prevent his authority being usurped by a temporal ruler. So except in these cases of necessity, the spiritual ruler is forbidden to wield the temporal sword, even though it belongs to him in extremis, but he's immediately to reassign it to someone else who is permitted to use it. So that would mean that, like in the Europe that followed the Dark Ages, when the barbarians had destroyed ordinary civil government, bishops took up some civil authority. It was necessary for them to give it back to lay people as soon as they possibly could. Now, this means that although the spiritual power reigns over and judges the temporal power, it cannot do so in matters which are indifferent, in questions of how many pennies in the pound, or in questions of which side of the road to drive on. Other examples of that would be, for example, to take controversial modern cases, the death penalty. The death penalty is permissible in principle, but is undesirable. It should be avoided where it can be avoided, where it isn't necessary to maintain public safety and the rule of law. So the Church teaches that it's permissible in principle, that it should be avoided where it can be. What are the conditions where it could be used, where it shouldn't be used, and then it is for the laity to judge whether or not those conditions exist or not. Similarly, in regard to immigration, those with a well-founded fear of persecution, who can be given refuge without destroying the society into which they are received, should be welcomed, because it's a moral requirement to give shelter to the stranger, and it's necessary for the episcopal hierarchy to teach this. But the question of how many people a society can absorb in such circumstances, or how many purely economic migrants it can absorb, that is a question to be determined by the civil power, and therefore something to be considered by electors when deciding who their rulers should be. And therefore it's very important for bishops to be careful in limiting their teaching to what is actually contained in the divine or natural law, and allowing the laity the space to determine these indifferent matters. And of course they don't always respect that, just as corrupt politicians will pronounce that they are free to license the murder of unborn children, contrary to the divine and natural law, so overexcited bishops will attempt to teach in areas which are beyond their jurisdiction. But the actual limitations of the temporal and spiritual power are questions which are determined by divine law and laid out by the nature of their particular duties. One area in which this frontier is often contested is the question of economics, because people often have a lot at stake in that question, and that's something to which Leo comes most famously in his great encyclical Rerum Novarum on the rights and duties of capital and labour, which we will consider next.